I wanted to just give a talk today, as you just heard in the introduction, which sort of maybe stimulates some thinking about how we need to reassess and rethink how we address problems of security, insecurity, these sort of challenges on a global stage, and how when we think about those things, we really have to think a little bit beyond security or defense problems being all about conflict and war. And if I'm successful with the talk, I think what you'll see at the end of this is the motivations and the understanding of the reasons why we have to start thinking this way. So before I do that, just a very quick introduction to the Institute for Security Science and Technology at Imperial College. This introduction will also serve to contextualize many of the things I'm going to talk about in this talk, and you'll understand why the work we're doing is actually housed within the Institute. So our mission is really to look at and to communicate that security shouldn't just be viewed through this narrow lens of conflict and war. And the fact is that security challenges are very, very broad and very multifaceted these days. And so we want to challenge that perception and demonstrate the breadth and depth of a topic that touches everyone in society, wherever they are in the world. And if we think about the fact that you'll hear phrases such as gray zone warfare and people talking about the fact that security and defense challenges are becoming intermingled, and we start seeing issues of civil resilience and defense also being kind of conflated. Hopefully this gives you, well, that narrative explains why this kind of mission statement is what we're working towards at the Institute. So we were founded in 2008 as one of Imperial's Global Challenge Institutes, and these Global Challenge Institutes specifically were put together to sort of go after these hard global problems where we recognize that we need to bring together minds from different disciplines, from across our different faculties, from engineering, medicine, natural sciences, and the business school. But also we're here to sort of act as a convening center for external stakeholders, to bring in industry and to bring in government partners so that we can create a kind of environment within which we can most optimally solve these multifaceted, difficult problems. I guess some people have called them wicked problems in the past. And so, you know, this mission at Imperial is to harness insights from across Imperial, but there is this other element here of actually making sure that we're not sort of marking our own homework the whole time as academics, and we are actually connecting to the outside world and thinking about these problems in the context, in their operational context. And there are some really big global challenges out there, right? Climate and the environment, medicine and health, energy, the whole area of classically defined security and defense. And then we've got this whole sort of issue of sustainable development goals, or you could argue that the sustainable development goals kind of summarize many of these different challenges. And effectively, when you look at some of these different factors here, you see climate and the environment, and medicine and health. In very recent years, we've seen the huge complexity that these different domains bring with them when we start addressing problems within them. So obviously we've just had lived through a very unique situation in most of our lives with the pandemic, and that really showed the kind of need for sort of systems level thinking and global coordination. And I think it's fair to say that in many cases that those instruments and those methodologies that would be needed in those sort of scenarios were kind of left wanting. The climate and the environment is causing us a crisis in policy making and a crisis in our ability to understand how to solve such a big global problem from a technical perspective, but also from a collaborative global perspective. And the war in Ukraine has made many people realize that you cannot decouple issues like energy and energy provision from problems like defense, warfare, and conflict. And in fact, you can't decouple issues such as finance and the economy from all of these things. So whilst a few years ago, if I'd have said to you that all of these challenges are very, very interlinked and interconnected, you would have argued perhaps, or some would have argued, that this was a theoretical kind of academic construct of how the world was. And in the last 5 years, we have actually seen the demonstration through real world events that have shown, in fact, that this is a very, very deeply interconnected space. And so there's a lot of complexity here. The map of the world on this PowerPoint slide is deliberately upside down. The idea is we have to reimagine how we're going to deal with these sort of global events and global problems and look at the world in a different way. I think the way to how we look at it just now, and recognize when all we're dealing with is conventions that don't actually have to be held to if we want to try and solve some of these problems. And of course, there is no right way up for the map, by the way, right? If you think about it. So some work that we've done at the Institute over some time to actually map out some of this complexity. You know, the hypothesis here is that insecurity in the world, insecurity is a sort of precondition for warfare, right? Okay, so if we have these kind of, you know, situations of insecurity, eventually, if they're left sort of untreated and unaddressed, and, you know, we end up in a situation where we have high probabilities of warfare and conflict. And so we really need to try and address these issues of insecurity, drive them down, and mitigate those risks of ending up in this sort of warfare domain. And this is a kind of the beginning of thinking about how we go beyond just talking about war and conflict when we talk about defense and security. And here, when we start seeing what are the drivers for insecurity, of course, it's fairly obvious when you start thinking about it, but scarcity of water, nutrition, natural resources, general economic hardship, political instability, hostile threats from criminals, terrorists, and nation states, all of these things come together, and many other factors as well. And in the graph on the right-hand side, this is our attempt to draw out a kind of ontology or an interconnected map of all of these different issues to get some sort of understanding of all of the different factors that were at play. And when we did this piece of work, it just became very evident just how complicated things are. I mean, on this graph here, what we do is, it's not a great visualization, but the connections between different nodes are actually kind of weighted. So we were able to understand exactly how interrelated some aspects were, to what extent one aspect was interrelated with another as compared to, let's say, another pair. So this is a way of testing or understanding where the priority areas are that we might need to work on. And when we look at this complex problem space, it's clear that science and technology, or disruptive technologies, give us a potential, provide the potential for us to analyze this space, and then also figure out where we might be able to develop further science and technology to solve some of these problems, or to mitigate some of the risks that I've just talked about with respect to insecurity. And that is a really important place for us as scientists and academics to kind of focus our minds, and obviously a big global challenge that needs to be addressed. So I want to just dwell on this idea of technology and how technology and human beings are kind of evolving and now collaborating with each other in the world. What kind of society are we living in? And how does technology really play a role? Well, back in the early or late 1940s, early 1950s, people like the gentleman on the screen here, Norbert Wiener, were starting to think about how our tools, how our machines were possibly changing, or how we could change them to make them more useful. And up until this time, I guess many people had thought of our machines and our tools as being fairly mechanistic things that we would actuate or move ourselves, our minds directly controlling something, a fairly inert object. But the thought kind of developed that what if we could end up with machines that were actually a little bit more like us? We're able to take in signals and information, process those signals and information, and actually then act in the world in a manner similar to human beings. Wouldn't this be a more useful set of tools to develop? And would it be possible in the future for those tools to act as more sort of collaborative agents with human beings? And as Norbert Wiener was thinking about these things, this whole area of cybernetics emerged. In fact, it was first hypothesized and postulated in the book that he wrote called Control and Communication in the Animal and the Machine, a copy of which front cover is on the slide right now. And so this is the idea about how humans and their tools and their machines could create a different kind of society. And this thinking starts around the 1950s. And around about that same time, people are thinking about how we might create artificial intelligence in the world, and a few other things like that. Computing is moving on at great leaps and bounds. And so you have the beginnings of a lot of important technological disruptions that we now see throughout our society, providing massive changes to the way that we live. And this leads us eventually, I won't explain exactly how we get there, but we get to a situation where we start seeing the development of machines that can actually learn. So rather than machines that just simply do what we tell them, machines that can measure their environments, figure out something about their surroundings or a task that we give them, and then calculate or figure out themselves to some extent how to undertake those tasks and actions in the world. And this can be software actions. These could be smart software tools, like the kind of things that you interact with every day on the internet these days. But these can also have, this software can actually be embedded in hardware, so we can make smart hardware systems. And what you're seeing here is, on the left-hand side is a graphical representation of an artificial neural network, which is the kind of core idea behind us building machine learning and AI software. And then on the right-hand side, you're seeing some videos. I hope they're moving for you, but you can see some videos of our attempts to make machines that kind of do what we do, okay? And in the top left of this grid, you'll see some robotic tests that DARPA did just over a decade ago, actually, where they were trying to get these robots to do fairly straightforward things. You can see with some sort of limited success. They probably look like maybe, well, some of you might remember acting a little bit like this, maybe on a big night out, but this is certainly not a useful state for a machine to be in. But if you look around the grid here, then you can see some of the very latest robots from Boston Dynamics trying to learn how to kind of maneuver themselves around an obstacle course, and failing to do so on the right-hand side, but going through a learning process, which eventually takes us to the sort of video in the bottom right-hand corner, where the Atlas robot from Boston Dynamics is figuring out how to pick up a heavy weight, negotiating stairs, and actually looking quite human-like in its action. So this is kind of where we've got to today. And I guess what I'm trying to really highlight to you is that we live in this, and cybernetics, by the way, it's from that phrase cybernetics that the whole phraseology around cyber and cybersecurity is then drawn, okay? So cybernetics is, of course, talking about our computational tools and how our computational tools might create these kind of robots. And so we kind of think that today what we're living in is this cyber physical world, a world in which our computing systems can take physical action in the world, but also where physical phenomena can actually retrain and retune our computing systems. And in the middle of it all, human beings, of course, collaborating with these tools to actually create this kind of cyber physical society and cyber physical world. So it's a very interconnected space, and the globe that you're seeing spinning around here is just to show how interconnected we are, and also show you some of the risks of some of this interconnectivity. So with it, this technology has brought huge, leaps and bounds in terms of progress over the last few decades, but there are risks, of course, as well. So this is results, the red dots on this graph are results of a search engine search that I had one of my students do a few years ago. And this was to find computing devices that are installed in critical national infrastructure domains around the world. So they might be running energy power plants, they might be running water distribution systems or transport networks. To find those computers that were running these things, cyber physical networks, that actually still had the passwords and administrator, so the usernames and the administrator passwords as they had been set from the factory on the day they were set out. So these things all have like default username admin and password. So very quickly what we could have done is logged into these, and I could have been in a system in Australia, and a few seconds later in a system in India, then somewhere in Europe, and then in America. And at this point, what I'm able to do in this cyber physical world is not just mess around with digital information, but physically start messing around with things, right? Okay, so there are physical and cyber impacts from this kind of security risk. And it leads us to also think about geographical boundaries, nation states, and whether or not, this idea that nation states can actually deal with their security just on their own is something which is is tenable these days, right? And going forward, sustainable. So there are a whole heap of these kind of disruptive technologies that are going to drive us further and further down this road. Many of them you'd have come across in the popular press or in your technical reading if you're into that sort of thing. So of course, there's a lot of noise right now about harnessing the quantum domain, machine learning and data processing we've just covered, advanced computer-enabled hardware systems. More and more work is being done on networks, encryption, and things like blockchain, especially in the world of finance. And then, materials manipulation, including synthetic biology and novel materials design. All of these things are coming together right now and are moving forward at real pace, so that even though we've seen huge changes in the last few decades, we are literally on the verge of seeing an even greater level of change over the coming decades because of these developments. And the technologies that are likely to result here are quantum computing, which may allow us to crack encrypted messages of today, for example, advanced augmented reality systems where we might be able to live in digital worlds, concepts that people have referred to as the metaverse. Amazingly sort of novel materials and structures that we're able to kind of control at the nanometer scales and at the atomic levels, advanced communication and encryption systems, augmentation of ourselves through direct connection of technologies with us as human beings, and of course, a movement closer to true artificial intelligence. We have machine learning right now, but we might eventually end up in a situation where our machines are actually, sentient and much closer to being, well, if they get sentient, then they will be truly artificial intelligent. We don't quite have that yet at the moment. So we have to then think a little bit, some of the work I've been doing recently, in particular with NATO, is how if I'm thinking about defense and security, do I keep pace with all of this stuff that's happening around me? What does all of this mean for defense and security? And this is a question that, NATO posed itself a few years ago. And I've been lucky enough to chair a group, as you heard earlier on, that's been advising the Secretary General and NATO on exactly what it might need to do to keep pace. Now, we've come up with a bunch of recommendations in the report in 2020, which I've got a picture of here. One of them is to have NATO be the sort of core domain within which principles for responsible use and ethical use for these emerging technologies in defense and security could be set. We also saw an opportunity for a group like NATO to help house and coordinate innovation in this space in a kind of in a way that is kind of multinational, recognizing the fact that these sort of enclave kind of national sort of ideas are kind of a little bit well, it's a little bit out of date when you think about the interconnecting power of all the technology. And also we realize that this whole alliance is able to tap into a huge amount of technology, science and technology talent. And so in summary, what we recommended to NATO was it needed to co-develop technologies, it needed to invest in them, but it also needed to increase its technical literacy as an organization, recognizing that in many cases, our decision makers, unfortunately, are not as technically literate as we would like them to be. And this is a real risk, okay, because at this moment in time, if we are setting national policy and international policy in security and defense applications, we don't have policy making machinery that is actually understanding or has a good understanding of some of the stuff that we've just talked about very quickly here, then we of course risk getting some of those policy postures, etc., very, very wrong. And that can have big consequences. So we've actually done something about it, okay? So over the last few years, I've been working in this group. We haven't just made some recommendations on what to do. I'm going to focus on the work I've done at NATO as an example of how we might really address some of these, a global challenge or take on these global challenges by building something. So we decided that in fact, a couple of things were needed. If we wanted NATO to co-evolve technology, that it needed an accelerator, a kind of an ability to promote and give grants to startups and innovators working to disrupt this area of security and defense. And that became DIANA, which is the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic. We also recommended that NATO needed to co-invest, not just be able to give grants out, but actually have skin in the game as an equity taker in some of the startups and disruptive technologies that we'll see coming around the corner in the next few decades. And that became an idea known as the NATO Innovation Fund. And this pair of organizations have now actually been announced by the Secretary General and are in the process of being stood up. And in concert, an accelerator program in DIANA connected to something like the NIF or the NATO Innovation Fund develops this kind of innovation engine, okay, for the alliance, where we can take fundamental science and technology connected to places like universities, pick the right ones to put through something like an accelerator program, marry them to venture capital and to growth capital, and eventually hopefully see the technologies, products and services of tomorrow hitting the end user space. And Diana is going to try and do these things, convene these triple helix stakeholders from government, industry and academia, not just give out money, but also on the funding side, look specifically at emerging and disruptive technologies and how we can harness them for the future. The idea will be to open up a network of accelerators, network of accelerators and testing and prototyping facilities across the alliance. And the idea is to have this operational, well, partially operational this year and then fully operational by 2025. This is available on multiple websites now, but this is a published kind of list of where some of the early sites will be. The headquarters will actually be based at Imperial College London here in White City, in the campus I'm sitting in right now, our new 25-acre campus in West London. And we will then have a network of accelerators coordinated by those headquarters across the alliance. And what we're really going to try and do here is engineer serendipity. So create spaces where industry, government and academic partners can actually bump into each other and actually can learn from each other to co-evolve the technologies in an agile, flexible manner, right? In a way that hasn't really been done before, because previously what we've seen is that academics, industry and startups and government don't necessarily always talk to each other as frequently as they should. So the idea is to kind of convene them all together, smush them all together and create that collision space. We can create a protected environment to mitigate risks of technology loss, to say undesirable markets. And very importantly also, we can create a situation where we augment levels of inclusivity and diversity in the mission of defense and in NATO in this case, creating an appealing landing zone for future talent. So this is basically a game-changing proposition for a world that is being transformed by game-changing technology, is the way that we would put it. And on this slide, you're seeing a map of the Imperial College White City campus, which is 1/3 complete, which is where all the grey buildings are. And then to the south, sorry, the green buildings are, and to the south of where the green buildings are across the A40 Westway, the empty bit is where all the new buildings are going to go in the next few years. I'm sitting in one of them, so you can rest assured they are being built. So just in the last couple of minutes, I want to talk about some of the challenges, these global challenges in security and defense that take us beyond this concept of war and conflict. And why do we think about that? Well, let's look at it this way, right? If I'm thinking about security problems, there is a superset of these global security problems. Climate change is going to drive conflict in the future, as it's going to mean, fewer resources, pressures on water, pressure on food, driving migration. So something like climate change, which every country in the world has to collaborate on to try and solve. There's no partitioning up the problem to try and solve it. But that kind of problem, we need to try and address it so that the subset of the problems of security, I would argue these big global insecurity problems, a subset of these problems are conflict and war, right? That's a subset of this whole global security problem space. And what we need to be able to do, or we should be working towards in defense and security, is making this bubble smaller, putting a pressure on it so the probability of conflict and war, the set of conditions when we end up in conflict and war, are actually smaller. And we can do that by trying to solve the issues of insecurity, as well as trying to find the technologies that would allow us to execute conflict and warfare when they do occur in the most efficient, low impact, low damaging ways possible, right? That's the sort of holistic defense and security posture that we are trying to take with some of the work we're doing. And there are some huge specific technical challenges coming around the bend, which are going to sort of challenge how we're able to do this, how we're able to collaborate with each other, how we're able to even understand what our own identities are and how we relate to things like our nation states. And our identity in particular is something that's potentially going to change massively in the coming years. What I'm showing you here is some machine learning generated faces from a site called This Person Does Not Exist. None of these people that you're seeing on the left-hand side have ever existed. These are computer generated images, which can actually help us to build three-dimensional avatars in the metaverse space. And so we're at the point here of a society that moves to a digital space, which is an actual living space. It's an actual extension of what it means for us to be living in the world. We're able to create an economic system in there by using cryptocurrencies and blockchain technologies, and using this kind of technology to create photorealistic avatars with ourselves, with haptic feedback, wearables and things like that. This actually means that rather than just being a gaming environment, the idea of a metaverse is really about a new domain in which human activity is going to exist. And what we do to defend that space, what borders look like in there, what does identity mean in there, and what does citizenship mean in there, are all things which are massively challenging to deal with. Another big challenge, if we look at our environment, or a good example of it, is our oceans. So this is a map just showing you where all the hotspots for sort of illicit fishing activity around the planet. Okay, illicit fishing at the moment drives a lot of human trafficking. It drives a lot of criminality, but at the same time, if we're able to solve problems of illicit fishing, we may also be able to provide, for example, our navies with very, very good situational awareness should they get into situations of conflict. And what I'm trying to highlight here is that our technologies that we go after should have dual uses. And the dual use aspect came up in a slide earlier on. I just didn't mention it. But what I mean by dual uses is that we're going after technologies where we can address things like the Sustainable Development Goals. We can address things like criminality and sustainability in the environment, as well as developing the tools that we might need should conflict actually erupt, which is likely to happen for decades to come, until we solve big problems like energy. And again, we can talk about this maybe in the Q&A in a minute. And if we look on another axis of these global challenges that drive insecurity, we have to look at problems like financial inclusion. So still in the world, this is a few years old, but the numbers are still very close. We have about 1.7 billion adults that lack any real access to any financial services or infrastructure. And just take a note where these big red spots are on the globe. And on the next graph, I'm going to show you an overlay really that shows you something else. And this is a measurement of multidimensional poverty around the world. So if you think about where those red spots were in terms of financial inclusion, and then think about this graph, what this graph is showing, World Mapper here, they do a really great job. They take an index of the world. In this case, they're measuring poverty. And depending on how severe the problem is, or the magnitude of the index number is, they dilate the country. So the more dilated the country, the worse the problem is. Okay, so you can see here where the levels of multidimensional poverty are at their worst, and you overlay that with the dots I showed previously, and you can see that without financial inclusion, we also have these problems of multidimensional poverty. We can start seeing the conditions that we're setting the conditions up for more conflict in the world, unless we start attacking this problem of insecurity that I've just mentioned. So really what we're talking about here is trying to align our defense and security missions to deal with those sustainable development goals that I talked about earlier on. Last couple of slides, I wanted to show you this. What is the urgency for change here? Well, some of you may have come across this measurement before, but this is called the Doomsday Clock. It's published by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. It's something that was produced in 1947, I believe, so just after the Second World War. The idea being here that an analysis is done to show how close the world is to effectively destroying itself through dangerous use of technologies. Basically, how close we are to sort of harming ourselves because of the stuff we're making. And the closer the clock is to midnight, the worse things are, right? The clock, I believe, in 1947 probably started at something like 7 or 8 minutes to midnight. And in 2023, the clock has been set to 90 seconds to midnight. It is the closest it has ever been to midnight ever since the clock was published. So I'd like to stop there, Katri, if I may. I know we've gone through a lot of different things there, but I hope some of that has been thought-provoking and will maybe instigate some interesting questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Chana. That was so mind-bogglingly huge and vast area that, 90 seconds sounds like we are head to disaster now. But so I open the floor to questions now. And if anybody would like to raise your hands and ask directly, that's fine. Or if you want to then use, okay, there are a few questions. Let's see. There is a question. This is from Jana Tarma, and we can all imagine nefarious uses for AI. Yes. How are you looking to counteract, for instance, deep fakes, credible impersonations, etc.?
It's a great question. So you have these things, okay, in machine learning, you have these things called generative adversarial neural nets, okay? And what we do with these things is, on the one hand, we are able to produce deep fakes, and we use another machine learning algorithm to kind of detect those deep fakes. And it's a bit strange because this generator of deep fakes and this detector of deep fakes can actually help to train one another. They kind of get better by playing a game between themselves. So actually, through the development of these kind of GAN techniques, you end up kind of with a bit of a space race between the two sides. So it's a constant game or battle, if you like, between trying to figure out and spot deep fakes and also trying to produce them, because actually producing very, very high quality synthetic data can actually be very useful in the world as well as the kind of more nefarious things that you've seen, sort of fake presidential addresses from Barack Obama. I think some of you may have seen that. But there is a lot of work actually being done on how we might use machine learning techniques to detect deep fakes. One methodology that one of the things we're looking at actually at the moment is how you might have a deeper understanding of the physical processes, of the physics involved in a particular scenario that might help you to better train a machine learning algorithm to spot if something is fake. But it's a challenging area, and it's getting more challenging all the time.
Thank you. Then is NATO looking at land security issues as sea level rises? And if not, do you know who is? This is from Alan Gilbert.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. That's great. NATO is looking at quite a number of different things to do with climate-driven insecurity. In fact, there was it's actually a really nicely written report that was recently published by NATO on exactly how it sees climate change and climate issues actually driving the kinds of levels of insecurity that I was talking about and the problems of insecurity. So land security, because of sea level changes and rise, is definitely something that is being considered. In fact, if I recall correctly, it's explicitly in that report somewhere. I can find some contacts for you. I can't recall off the top of my head who at NATO specifically would be looking at that problem. Although my advisory group on EDTs, it's kind of on our sort of radar to look at. But if you'd like to follow up with me afterwards, I can try and find some contacts for you. I'm not sure if you want academic contacts or contacts at NATO or whatever else, but feel free to shout out and tell me what kind of contacts you'd like. Hi, Alan. Oh, I think you're still on mute.
Thanks. Yeah, I've been trying to find out who's really looking into this, and I haven't found anybody. So I'm sure there are people.
There are, yeah, okay. I mean, if you'd like me to, we can find out for you a bit at NATO. I can tell you there are people over. I know there are people over at in the DoD that are looking at this sort of stuff. There's a group in particular that I worked with a little while ago who were looking at the ways in which littorals were going to change as a result, right? So littorals is the phrase, of course, used for the sort of those kind of shallow water areas on the coast, and the maritime group that I'm a part of too has also considered this issue too. There's an interesting group called Task Force 59, headed up by a friend of mine called Commodore Michael Brasser in the US Navy. If you Google Task Force 59, you'll see that, in fact, they are running that situational awareness project for the ocean that I was talking about. We stood that up a couple of years ago. So actually, they would be a really good group to talk to if you wanted some further contacts and links. I can put you in touch with them. It's a project I'm involved with. So
Thanks very much. Thank you.
No problem.
Then there's a comment or maybe a question from Ian. I would have thought the Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest we have ever been to midnight.
Yeah. Yeah, you would think that, and I think, you know, I mean, I showed you that clock, just, you know, not in any way to evangelize for it being the metric and index for global insecurity, but it's just one that's been running for some time, and I do have quite a lot of respect for the way that it's done. It's run out of Chicago University. You might wonder why that's the case, right? I mean, you know, when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, you will see on the clock actually it gets much closer to midnight than it had been before, etc. The compounding issues that we have right now that drive this clock so close to midnight are a few things. First of all, that we still have nuclear weapons in the world, and we are seeing a more bellicose kind of verbal, a more assertive kind of political narrative around the use of nuclear weapons, right? And that's been happening in recent years. You couple that with a complicated cyber-physical network that I talked about, i.e. all of these sort of systems being connected, and the risk of cybersecurity creating some kind of issue which then leads to nuclear conflict is right in the mix there, especially when you think about disinformation and misinformation. So that's another part. When you talk about cybersecurity, you don't just talk about the fact that machinery can be messed with, but what we are seeing is a destabilization, if you like, of knowledge ecosystems, which is hugely disruptive. I mean, trying to find the truth these days is a very difficult thing to do. Couple that with this whole idea of deep fakes, because of course that's how we can drive disinformation and misinformation campaigns, and the risk of climate change. When you put all of those different things together, it's the confluence of all of that that really brings that clock so close to midnight. And it's the reason why we've not been, when you think about all of those factors together, it's the reason why we've never been so close, because a lot of this stuff augments the probability of an accidental or a misadventure with nuclear weapons, which is not a state that we've had in the past. I would argue that if you couple that with a lack of technical literacy within our organizations, our governmental organizations and our leadership organizations, there's a very compelling case for saying that it is right that we are closer than we have ever been before. We also, by the way, if you think about it, maybe 20 or 30 years ago, the people who were around when nuclear weapons were first kind of put out there was a lot more kind of expertise or knowledge about how that happened and the situations that led to that. That's changing rapidly, right? We're moving into a generation where nuclear weapons are the norm, and almost kind of normalized a little bit. So that's another risk factor that we have to bring into all of this. I hope that sort of answers your question.
Yeah, it was more of a comment. I mean, growing up in the 80s, there was a perception that nuclear war was game over, whereas you're now seeing sort of rhetoric coming out of, especially from the Russian media, that nuclear war is possibly acceptable, and that is a significant change. Well,
and actually, look, you know, it's nice for us to, and the Ukraine. Look, I'm not about to downplay the Ukraine-Russia war. It's a huge amount of lessons to be learned. So the important thing is we need to learn the lessons, right? Question is, are we learning them? I think in my last slide there, I said something like, I didn't read it out, but it said something like the technology, science and technology has got a huge potential, these disruptive technologies, for moving us into a much better state of insecurity, right? So we're getting to a much safer world, but that same technology has got the potential to move us into a much greater state of insecurity. And it's easy to abdicate responsibility to the technology, but it's us as human beings, it's our actions that dictate which way they go. So this bellicose rhetoric around the use of nuclear weapons, okay, Putin has said it, but guess what? There are some, well, the most major countries in the West have done exactly the same thing in recent years too. So unfortunately, the responsibility lies across the political spectrum on both sides here to make sure that we don't normalize the use of nuclear weapons. I think the president of the US said a few years ago, what's the point of having them if we're not prepared to use them? That's not really a great way to go. And you'll see that our position right now in terms of proliferation has changed in some of our strategies. And so this spreads around the world, this normalization that it's okay to start talking about it and, you know, potentially using them. And even the concept of sort of safe nuclear weapons and this kind of stuff, you know, using them in a safe way. As soon as you start getting into all of that, it's a very slippery slope. And then, of course, the technology will be driven down that route. Yeah, that's thanks, Ian. I agree with what you're saying.
Then, thank you. And then there's a question from Richard Balmford. What innovations would do the most to alleviate the security situation? For instance, fusion power to give equitable global access to clean power.
Yeah, Richard, as I said, I'm a physicist by training. I'm completely aligned with you there. You've mentioned fusion specifically. We have to, ultimately, at the end of the day, the way I view things, that the root problem that we have to solve around the world is that we're competing with each other for finite energy resources. That's ultimately what this is all about, okay? Because if I was able, Carrie, to give you a budget for the whole of your life, an energy budget for the whole of your life, to do whatever you wanted to do with that energy budget, become whatever you wanted to become. If we were able to do that for every citizen on the globe in some sort of, you know, hypothetical world, of course, this removes a lot of the need for the conflict and competition that we see. We can solve problems of food and all of the other things by having so much an abundance of energy. But the reality is we don't have that. We have contested space over energy. So our investments into things like fusion have to really kind of, I believe, have to be greatly augmented. You know, we have to almost look at a kind of Manhattan Project style effort here to see if we can get something like fusion technology to be usable, because these are the real pathways to taking us into a different state of global security than we are today. And some of the green energy technologies that you see are, you know, very laudable in one respect, but on the other hand, there are some other issues with that too. So if you look at things like, you know, driverless cars, for example, and electrification, and to the kind of those kind of ideas, they might deliver clean situations in one part of the world, but the natural resources, the rare earth metals, etc., that we then need to be able to take them, are creating horrendous situations in another part of the planet. And if you're worried about climate change, you know, the climate doesn't care about human borders. So it might be out of sight and out of mind, but it certainly will not be without impact on all of us.
Yes, there's a next question. A serious risk driven by the climate, according to the UN, is the impact of climate change and population growth in Africa. These are expected to drive mass migration northwards. What can be done? Yeah,
that's from Vincent, right? Yeah.
Vincent,
yeah, I was born in Africa, actually. I was born in Nairobi until I was about 11 years old. I lived in North Africa. It goes a little bit back to what I said earlier on. There is a serious risk of that, of course, right? And we're going to see population growth in places like Africa. And yeah, the concern is, of course, that the migratory pressures and the movement of people is then going to cause, you know, it will drive, you know, higher risks of conflict and war. But the problem you've got to ask yourself is, why are people moving? And they're moving again, principally because of what I've just talked about earlier on, the scarcity of certain things, right? The availability of resources, the availability of strong economies, the availability of opportunities for their families, for their children, etc. You know, these are the kind of things that move people around the world. And so really what we have to try and do is to create equitable situations across the globe such that we do not see the pressures for people wanting or having to move. I often say to people that I talk to, if you're in a certain situation and you couldn't feed your family, or it was a struggle to get water, or you thought there was a real chance that you couldn't access the best education for your children, what would you do? Would you stay where you were, or would you try and figure out a way to move somewhere where in fact you could solve some of those problems? And it's a very human thing. It's not a geographically unique thing, but it's a very human thing to sort of probably get up and do something about it and move. If you were placed in that situation, I guarantee you any right-thinking person, when pushed, would decide that actually it was time to get up and move. And so it's very logical, I would say, this idea of wanting to move when in fact you don't have the kind of conditions for prosperity and stability around you. So that means also making sure that we promote stable governments and good governance and all of these sort of things. There is a huge amount of self-interest in us being able to do that, right?
Then Alan Grant, we seem to be witnessing the first anniversary of a military conflict with aggression led by a misguided, deranged leader being countered by carefully controlled support of technology, intelligence, crypto, advanced weapons, and so on. How do you see this experiment progressing?
Well, it's a great question. So Alan, is it? I'm just reading it from there. Okay. Well, how do I see that experiment progressing? It really is a little bit of a live experiment. I think, yeah, I mean, I think this specific thing that we're seeing play out right now, there is a lot of hope that actually this strategy and this tactic will eventually end up in a situation where some sort of resolution can be achieved, right? Because obviously this isn't going to carry on, cannot carry on forever. So there is a hope here that this tactic is actually going to mean that this particular conflict is stabilized. Whether or not this should then translate into a strategy for future use, I think is a totally different question. I'm not entirely convinced that this would be a sensible thing to look back on and go, right, we now have a strategic tool here, because every time something like this happens, we'll just try and use this mechanism to be able to try and kind of resolve the situation. So I think it certainly stands a very good chance of working in this instance. But I think there's a lot of time decay on our ability to use this kind of tool in the future. We shouldn't convince ourselves that this is in some way a generalizable solution. We really have to think about some of these more systemic risks that I talked about earlier on to ensure that we're not in these situations of vulnerability in the future. I mean, if you look at, for example, what happened when the war broke out, we've had food security issues, energy insecurity issues, we've had movement and migration issues, we've had human trafficking abuses all over the place. None of our global systems have actually been in any real fit purpose or situation or state to deal with that. The Ukrainians themselves are actually doing some amazing work with cryptocurrencies and decentralized finance to mitigate their own financial systems failure in helping to support their citizens inside this kind of conflict scenario. So there is a lot of interesting spin out that's going to come from this. But as a tactic, as a generalizable tactic, I wonder whether we'll look back and think, well, fortunate that we were able to do this time. How can we not have to do this again? That would be a sensible way of approaching it. But again, that may not be where the analysis falls out.
Thank you. Then Ben is asking, you have mentioned criminal activity. How can this be controlled, particularly when states are willing to support or condone it?
Yeah. Ben, if you're online, are you thinking of anything like a specific example of that, or I mean,
well, yeah, in particularly sort of the hacker farms, but effectively the state's use of criminal activity to magnify its capability, or at least do it in a way that the state could distance itself from.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a serious problem. Over the last few hundred years, again, that's a strategy which has served many countries very well. And I think we should be able to step back and take a very honest look at everyone's history and figure out when that's happened. And unfortunately, it seems to have stuck as, again, a strategy and a tactic that is fairly successful, right? You can do this kind of stuff, and then suddenly, yeah, you're supporting things like, as you say, independent hacking activities in the cyberspace and this sort of stuff. I think, again, what you need is to be able to create consensus groups. You need to be able to create a multinational kind of agreements, and also set sort of the rules and values of those groups, and then live up to those values as well in how you actually execute what you do. All of those things have to happen in order for you to be able to then hold each other to account. But if you look at what's also been happening in recent years, we see a lot of politics of isolationism juxtapositioned with the technology of connectivity. So the technology is connecting us like crazy all over the world. The world's becoming a lot smaller in terms of our ability to reach out to one another. And at the same time, we have this sort of politics of kind of like hunkering down and being isolated in many parts of the world. And as soon as you do that, that insularity, if you like, then means that you are not necessarily going to have agreements on what is defined by criminality, what defines criminality, what is beyond the pale, etc. And I really think it's that kind of multilateral consensus thing that has to be focused on, and in particular with how we develop our technologies and use them, because some of the things around machine learning and AI, there are very dangerous things you could do with that technology, and there are some very powerfully positive things you can do, and which way we go with that is going to depend on consensus. If you don't have consensus, you could end up in a situation where I'm a nation state and I'm developing AI under this kind of value proposition, and then country X over here is doing something else and not caring about those kind of values, and then I get worried that maybe they're progressing at a rate faster than I am because I'm constrained by these values. So what do I do in that situation? I decide to delete my values and say, well, actually, let me get rid of them so I can just keep pace. And then suddenly everybody anneals to the lowest kind of common denominator, and then there's no difference between good and bad at that point. It's just everyone's just ended up in the same terrible state, and that's the situation we have to try and avoid. Again, having technically literate political leaders to be able to navigate this space, I think, is very important.
Jim Cunningham, how do we avoid getting COVID out and too slow to respond when bird flu could still hit us? A concern expressed today when reminded by reports of a child death from it. When we are in weak recovery mode, even if we improve the vaccine technology.
Yeah, I'm of the view that we're sort of rapidly forgetting about the major lessons that we need to learn from COVID. Already it seems to be a problem that's disappearing in the rearview mirror. The big lesson to learn from it was how terrible we were as a globe in responding. I know it's sort of fashionable to pat ourselves on the back. Nation by nation, what we did was pat ourselves on the back about how we did well as a country, which is the most ridiculous thing to do, because the pandemic was screaming at you, I don't care about your borders. This is a pandemic. It literally was a natural event to demonstrate the similarity of all human beings on the planet and the similarity of our vulnerabilities and the need for coherent coordination. And all it managed to do in my book was to manifest our need for kind of almost nationalist kind of responses with some sort of kind of on the fly, see how it goes kind of collaboration over the top of it. And it's very surprising to me that we're not actually thinking about this a lot more seriously now and being very honest about how brittle that was. My view is if COVID had just been a little bit more deadly, not too much more, but just a little bit more deadly, we would be in absolutely massive amounts of problem. And in fact, what saved us in my view is that it just wasn't quite that little bit more deadly, not that we had some kind of amazing response. I would however say the great thing that we can look back on with respect to that, and the other lesson to learn, is the long-term investment in fundamental science and technology research and development. I think the public thought that the mRNA stuff just happened overnight, and realizing that this is decades and decades worth of fundamental science and technology research ongoing, people knowing that this sort of thing was needed and it would be better to move the vaccine development kind of game forward. That's what allowed us to be able to do something rapid in the vaccine space. It certainly wasn't some 24-month wonderful, amazing sprint that created it. I know that's a nice political thing to say, but my wife is a neuroscientist and actually worked very heavily in the whole area of drug development. It just didn't work that way.
So maybe I ask the last question then, and it is, so can the AI take over before the humans destroy the planet in 90 seconds?
Possibly, right? One of the things we haven't managed to do, the difference between our machine learning and artificial intelligence, is we haven't managed yet to kind of embed value systems and things like that and aspirations into our machines. That's kind of what, as human beings, what we do, right? We set ourselves targets targets on certain things like, let's say, equality and diversity, because we know we haven't done well on it historically, right? So at the moment, the only agents on the planet that are able to do that is us. So my hope is that actually we're still in control, and my more than my hope, the belief, the truth is that we're still in control, and at the moment we get to set the standard and the direction. Yeah, but I guess it's not without it's not beyond the possibility that if something machine becomes truly sentient, and if we were to analyze what we are doing, it could decide that that this is not the right way, and yeah, maybe it'll save the day. But I'd like to think we're the ones that are still in control there.
Lovely. Thank you so much. I let our chairman, Professor David Southwood, to end the very, very interesting session. Thank you so much from my part.
Thanks,
well,
Gary.
thank you, Katri. Deeph, thank you so much for a magnificent display of multidimensional thinking about things we didn't, many of which we hadn't put together before. But as you pointed out, the world is connected now. And that requires really science and technology, which may have made the connection, but it's also got to be responsible for our own security. And I think you've given us a really wonderful show of how these things need to be put together in a global manner. And if you like, maybe we don't like it. But sadly, we all chose to live on this planet. I'm afraid the security of this planet is matters to all of us, whoever we are. So I thought it was a brilliant layout of the multifarious ways, if you like, that things can go wrong, but also that we should be able ultimately to control. And me, as in fact, we're all friends of Imperial College. I think we're delighted to see Imperial at the center of NATO's efforts here. And indeed, we're very proud of you for being the leader of that particular important step. So whether or not it's 90 seconds to midnight, it's now shortly after 5 o'clock, at least on my watch. And I think I will close out now by asking everybody to, let's say, unmute or use the clapping sign to show our usual appreciation. Excellent talk. Thank you so much.